Video games are a very fantastical medium. Not fantastic, although I happen to think they often are, but fantastical. As a certain oft-maligned figure in the industry once said, they're the sum part of all media made interactive. Millennia of storytelling precedes it, asking us to empathize with the hero, and then games come along and ask us to take up the sword ourselves. They throw us, the player, right into the saddle, and one has to wonder what happens when you take a regular mundane person and throw them into the middle of the fantasy that is a video game. Without a player, there is no game, and so we take our mundane human selves and place them into actual fantasy, and we live that life, if only for a short while. Games can make us understand experiences and live lives we could never live on our own. As video games are still a relatively new media form and ironclad terms are still elusive, scholarly impulses demand I make up some kind of masturbatory official-sounding term for it, so transfictional empathy would be the term I'd choose for that kind of immersive mental crossover. We're all heroes as far as video games are concerned, even if that hero is just a regular person living a mundane life with a little bit of fantasy on the side.
What is this place? It looks just like the shopping district.
How's it going? I'm Aaox, and as I've never been one to stay away from absolutes, I'm gonna go ahead and announce that I genuinely think that Persona 4 may be the single game I hold up as being my absolute top and most favorite of all time thus far. Persona 5 can suck my dick. It's been 8 years since we in the West first reached out to the truth back in December 2008, and Persona 5 has finally launched worldwide, having skipped an entire console cycle. Given my fondness for both the previous Persona, one might expect my excitement would be through the roof for the latest acid jazz picaresque infused iteration of the cycle, but it's not. This does of course have a lot to do with the brutal milking of the dead horse that Persona 4 became, but there's always been something very specific thematically to Persona 4 that, upon watching the trails and promotional materials, and indeed playing the game that is Persona 5, I noticed seemed to be missing, or at the very least, maligned in its creation. The tone of this series is a relatively unique one, but the fourth Persona game did something no other game has really done as well before or since, in my mind. The one major element that I thought it knocked out of the park, the one linchpin to its entire methodology, the one ironclad backbone of the game's theme that caused it to ricochet through popular culture like a peppy, retro-stylish, yellow-tinged magic bullet, was just how utterly pedestrian half the damn game was. Or more specifically, how well Persona 4 juxtaposed mundanity and fantasy in a cleave that ran right through its heart. This time we're zeroing in on the aforementioned fantasy-mundanity split, and why I think it's the cornerstone of Persona 4 and its success, as well as what it says about video games as a whole. So grab your golf clubs, put on your glasses, and follow me, ladies and gentlemen, into the TV world. To coin a phrase, fantasy can be made substantially more effective if it's injected into the mundane, and I don't mean the split that manifests itself in games like Devil Summoner, which involve a wholesale invasion of the fantastical into the mundane. I'm talking about a consistent through line where there is a clear dichotomy drawn between those two elements, and the lines are adhered to. The inciting incidents in Persona 4 are the ones that transpire when, therefore, the lines are crossed. Atlus walked this razor line between normality and fantasy and reinforced it with nearly every single design choice. However, I am, as always, getting ahead of myself. In order to understand what I'm talking about, one would have to understand what Persona 4 is, so allow me to elucidate if you're one of the couple dozen people on Earth who as of yet remain unaware of it. Of course, this would require you to have somehow managed to dodge the game itself, the fighting game spin-off, the rhythm game spin-off, the anime adaptation, the manga adaptation, the light novel adaptation, the Etrian Odyssey Persona 3 /fiction spin-off, the director's cut, the anime adaptation of the director's cut, the sequel to the fighting game spin-off, the film adaptation of the anime adaptation, the spin-off detective novel, the pachinko machine, the Daisy Kong. And if that is the case, then you have both my condolences and my respect, because the only people who could live under a rock large enough to blot out this particular slice of Japanese cultural phenomena would rival the Greek deity after whom its developer is named. Persona 4 is a game about a gang of teenagers and their bizarre anthropomorphized cartoon animal mascot character trying to solve a supernatural murder mystery. Think Scooby-Doo set in Japan, and you're basically more or less spot on, only it's more serious tonally, so the 13 Ghosts of Scooby-Doo. Does anyone remember the 13 Ghosts of Scooby-Doo? How do I remember the 13 Ghosts of Scooby-Doo? Regardless, in said game, people are thrown into a mysterious world inside television sets and killed by the physically manifested form of their subconscious emotions if they're still inside the television world when the weather in the real world takes a turn for the foggy. The victims of each killing appear in blurred half-glimpses on a mysterious supernatural television program called the Midnight Channel, which manifests rather fittingly at midnight on rainy nights. So your job is to work out who's going to be kidnapped, or else go inside the television world and save them from themselves before they start wrestling with Jungian philosophy, whilst all of the time trying to figure out the killer's identity and modus operandi. It's not going to win an Oscar, but the smaller scale, especially compared to its predecessor Persona 3, somehow creates a more compelling narrative than the typical JRPG fare of killing God with the power of friendship. You know, until the game makes you kill God with the power of friendship. I suppose they must be under obligation. As a side note, why do so many JRPGs do that? It was the same in Final Fantasy IX too. There's a villain who's been consistent throughout the narrative with reasonable or at least stated goals and motivations, and then you get to the end of the game and you beat them and suddenly, oh, by the way, it was God. Sorry, this video's going to be long enough even without the tangents, because it's not only the narrative of the game that discards JRPG traditions, but the very nature of player interaction with games themselves. So what deviations from the norm am I talking about? The most obvious and direct change in the design of Persona 4 when compared to Persona 3 is the fact that whilst Persona 3 took place in a large city, Tatsumiport Island, which, according to an interview in the Persona 4 official design works with Persona series art director Shigenori Soejima, was based off of Tokyo's Shinagawa ward. Persona 4 takes place in a small rural town, based on a place in central Japan with a tall mountain and a lake that has a large amusement park nearby. A meandering description then, but the city in question, based on my exhaustive research and enormous brain, is therefore likely Fujiyoshida in Yamanashi Prefecture. So we're dealing with two very different locations here and two very different stories. The intensity of Persona 3's end of the world narrative is supplanted by the more lax, less dramatic murder mystery plotline that the sleepy hidden rural town allows. Instead of fighting shadows that spawn in an enormous tower that mysteriously appears at the hidden 25th hour of the day that only a few people can experience and are heralds of the Queen of Night, Destroyer of Worlds, the gang in Persona 4 swoops into a television set after school to save one person at a time after they're thrown in by a killer they gradually start to close in on, and it's because of that reduction of scale that Persona 4 is really able to work its magic, and magic it certainly is. That magic, as I said earlier, is this fantasy mundanity split, and the small rural town of Inaba provides the perfect canvas for this mundane, small-time murder mystery to plunge the player into the shoes of a person who finds themselves balancing between the fantastical and the mundane, and that person is, in short order, you. Persona 4 takes the tabula rasa approach to its main character. They have no inherent personality, meaning that putting yourself into their shoes is not just easy, it's a recommended procedure. The game wants you to care about Inaba and the people in it. The level of projection facilitates the most powerful elements of the game, so keep that in mind as we move forwards, and whilst you do that, remember to spit upon the canonization of Narukami Yu. I hope he burns, he kills this whole series. Now, at this point, some of you might be wondering quite what I'm talking about when I throw this fantasy mundanity split term at you, and you'd be well within your rights too, so allow me to segue now into some examples of what I'm talking about, starting with the broad strokes. Persona 4 has two very distinct halves. For those of you unfamiliar with this series in the most utilitarian terms possible, it's essentially 50% dating sim, 50% typical JRPG. Actually, it's not really a dating sim so much as it is a socializing sim, but if we allow pedantry to bog us down, this video is going to get even longer. So here's the key, right? Persona 4's social, mundane daily life in Inaba cuts a really interesting figure next to the fantastical JRPG wildness of the television world. The design works say outright that the town of Inaba was designed to be overflowing with realism, since the Midnight Channel and Inaba are meant to act as visual polar opposites. It's like if there were a really ordinary businessman standing there gormlessly and beside him there was some crazy ripped JoJo posing maniac. The intentional disparity caused by the juxtaposition of Johnny protagonist's normal workaday life and Johnson Danger protagonist's adventures inside the television world all serve the game's core engagements, and they're really not shy about drawing attention to it. There's a crazy screen transition between the two halves that occurs every time the barrier of the television is crossed and the other world is entered, a juxtaposition of black and white lines flying towards the player, mimicking the ripple effect shown on TVs when your crew sticks their hands in them, looking something like the outline of a television screen itself. This is a kick to the brain, of course. Atlas wants you to be 100% sure that you are in a different place whilst within the TV world, hence the omnipresent static filter and changing camera angle, as well as the glasses the characters all wear. It's a subtle change, but it's just another one of the many ways the devs used visual cues to remind us that it's a change in kind, that something is different over there. It's like playing two different games, and you know it essentially is. Soejima mentions in the art book that the recurring design element of black and white used in direct contrast that's prevalent throughout the game is meant to represent the fact that people have two sides to them, and is an expression of the Persona power itself. There are several places where this crops up. The protagonist himself, for example, not only between his white hair and his black school uniform, but also the collar of that same Gakudan lends itself to this idea of duality. He's from the city but moved to the countryside. He left one fantastic place and came to a far more mundane place. The game starts with this concept and never really relents. Also worth noting is the fact that the fog is a greyish colour, a merging of black and white into one colour with no distinct lines separating the two, a lot like the protagonist's grey eyes. Add to the fact that the static, what appears on the television before the midnight channel comes on, is black and white shapes jumbled together in a bizarre pattern. We have yet another example of the lines between reality and fantasy blurring. Even the first enemies you fight are patterned with black and white stripes. It's stunning really how deep this goes, but of course it runs deeper than just the obvious TV world Inaba split. If any of you thought or indeed think that it's a bit odd that the protagonist should go and fight monsters wearing their school uniforms, games got that covered with Chie's early suggestion that the investigation team hide their armor and weaponry beneath their uniforms so as to not draw attention to themselves while sneaking into the TV at Junas. They're hiding the fantasy beneath the mundanity. They are reality, but they are bleeding into the fantasy, and the fantasy is beneath their mundanity. They live an ordinary life, but they also go on adventures inside the television. They're ordinary students, but they have personas. They can stab shadows with a physical mundane sword, or they can summon a manifestation of their psyche to shoot fire and lightning at them, or indeed to stab them with a metaphysical fantastical sword. It's worth noting too that you're really encouraged not to use the regular attack unless you think you're basically assured of victory, and that you'll be using your persona far more than your sword. You're in the fantasy now, kid. Fight fantasy with fantasy. This is because, as the central characters of this story, the investigation team need to be a mix of fantasy and mundane. This is mentioned by Soejima. In designing Rise, he specifically went out of his way to look at real-life idols that looked like they were straddling the line between the life of a star and that of a civilian. Chie is credited with being the turning point that defined the overall design flavor of the entire game, and her concept was being a cute girl who could exist in real life. They have to be able to traverse the barrier between the two, and it's very important to note that they can only pass through televisions after acquiring their personas once the duality has been established. It's only once they've gained their fantasy magic guardian demon that they can become both fantastical and mundane, and that's so thrilling to me. What an amazing idea. So here you are, the only people in the town that can solve a murder that is equally mundane and fantastical, as you yourself are both fantastical and mundane. You're a student one day answering test questions, eating steak skewers with your friends, inviting the girl you like up to the roof for the lunch you didn't do a very good job of making the night before, studying, reading books, just living a normal life, but then you're a hero the next as you summon gods, demons, and kings to cast magic spells at enigmatic shadow monsters and to save people from themselves. Of course, the one big thing, the reason why you have a time limit to save someone, is also extremely mundane. If you can't save the person before the fog comes, as it always does after multiple days of rain, the person inside the TV at the time will die. So how do you check to make sure that you're not about to lose to the march of time? You ask your younger cousin for permission, then change the television channel to the weather to watch the 5-day forecast. It's so utterly mundane. There is nothing fantasy at all about Persona 4's Inaba half until the late game, where the lines between fantasy and mundanity start to blur, and that is why the last quarter of the game feels actively frightening, or at the least very unsettling. It doesn't help that it's back to this.
So it's finally over.
Yeah, seriously. I wish we could have done it sooner.
And of course, as the special guy who got the power to cross the mundane fantasy threshold first, you get to enter the Velvet Room because you're a Persona series protagonist. To clarify, the Velvet Room is essentially a shop, only one that exists outside of recognizable space and time, in which you can fuse personae together to make stronger ones, or recall old ones either to fuse or because you really miss them. And of course, there's a door to enter this magical demon workshop in the TV world, but there's another entrance in reality, this time and space transcending limousine that allows you to literally summon Satan, no I'm not kidding, manifests itself as just another shop in the central shopping district, right next to the bookstore, because of course it does. This is a world wherein the magical dungeons are located inside a television, accessed by walking through a suitably large television set in the Walmart electronics department. Your special headquarters is the food court. The monsters you fight are subconscious human desires and thoughts given literal form. Your personas are influenced by casual conversation. Talking about the past in Golden will allow a persona to remember a skill it's forgotten, whilst talking about the future may make it learn a new skill. The game's just dripping with this fantasy mundanity split that makes your characters, who are a part of both worlds and by extension you the player, that much more special. It recontextualizes normalcy whilst also making fantasy seem pretty mundane, hilariously. It's locked away for the most part, and your friends suggest you go fight monsters in a dungeon the same way they'd suggest you go and grab a shake at the malt shop, and you're invited to live that life for a year. It's really cool. It's so cool that my vocabulary mostly falters when trying to describe quite how cool it really is. When you you boot up Persona 4, you first see your character boarding a train headed to Inaba. The final moments of the game involve your character getting back on that train to leave Inaba to head back from whence they came, and the ending is all the more tragic for your leaving both in-game and in reality. When you arrive in Inaba, your classmates welcome you in. When you leave Inaba, your classmates say goodbye, and it's not just the protagonist you inhabit who they're saying it to. This game really wants you to project yourself into its blank slate of a main character, and again, it has a very tangible, almost monumental reason for doing so. I would once again like to return to the idea of the world within the television, because as I've said, there's more than just the surface split to that concept. There is a reason specifically why Persona 4 chooses to have its dungeons locked away behind the screen of a television. I presume at this point you might be reaching the same conclusion I did as to why. It's because you also travel into a different world inside the television. In effect, you have the same powers your character does. You as a player live in the mundane. You live in a normal place with normal people and everything is rather regular, really. You read books, you hang out with people, probably study, maybe work. But then you get home and you sit down and you turn on a video game and you go into a fantastical world inside your television. You also can walk between the fantastical and the mundane. You do it just by playing Persona 4 or really any video game. A part of you lives in that fantasy. You have to be in there somewhere because games are by necessity incomplete products with failure states that must be avoided and victory conditions that must be achieved. Every game needs a player to play it. They're not like movies that just go whether you're there or not. They need you to exist. So you walk into the TV world and you interact with things inside of it because you're more than just a puppet master. You are that character and he is your avatar, your incarnation into that world. A persona, after all, is a representation of you. In Jungian psychology, on which Persona is entirely based on, to the point that in Golden they place 10 quick, actual non-sequitur educational lessons about it in the front-end menu to get you up to speed on the subject, personas are defined as the social face an individual presents to the world, a kind of mask, designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others and on the other to conceal the true nature of the individual. It's the hero beneath the student, the chainmail beneath the school uniform, the time and space transcending limousine in the shopping district. It's the world inside the television. The player also is a persona user, and your character is just as much your persona as Izanagi is theirs. This is of course not something that only Persona 4 does, but Persona 4 calls attention to it in ways that other texts of this ilk don't really dare to. The artificiality of Persona 4 melted away for me. The similarities between my own life living in a rural town, being in high school when the game was released, dealing with a lot of the same problems, made me wish I was there so much that despite 7 years having passed since I finished it, Rise is still one of my favourite anime girls, and Persona 4 sits steadfast at the top of the games I would call my personal favourites. Persona 4 ultimately tells a story about playing video games. One of the dungeons is the fourth wall breaking giant neon arrow pointing at the artificiality of it all, but for some reason we don't really question it. We're mundane people playing a fantasy video game in which you play as a mundane person going on fantastical adventures that looks a lot like a regular video game. The Ouroboros spirals through that dungeon, and I think it's very fitting that the video game dungeon comes during a break in the case during the summer holidays when certainly I at least have a strong memory of sitting back and playing video games. In Persona 4 you're practically forced to spend the final week of your summer vacation not maxing out social likes or leveling up in the dungeon but completing your summer homework. The Witcher 3 won't tell you not to go on a quest because you've got some algebra to solve. Persona 4 makes you think, man, I don't want to do homework, I've got friends to hang out with, this is a bummer. That's not really even role-playing anymore, that's just life. The mundanity in Persona 4 is its spine. The life that pumps through the mundane half is our own. The mundanity we experience in our day-to-day is the mundanity we play through in Persona 4's, albeit streamlined as if we were looking back on an interesting year in our own lives, where only the important parts and the times that had meaning are able to be recalled. The duality of the medium we've elected to be a part of and an audience to is one of my favourite things about it. Our media asks us to step out of our roles in life and jump into the shoes of someone going on a grand adventure, one that we could never go on in our own lives. The simple fact is that by making half the game seem so similar to the mundanity of our own lives, the game just comes alive in ways that more traditional fare could never even hope to. Even open-ended sandbox games don't allow for the empathy struck by this Japanese Scooby-Doo game. Persona 4 extends its hand towards us and asks us to step into the TV world and be the hero, despite our mundanity, because it is our mundanity that makes us heroes, even if that hero is just a regular person living a mundane life with a little bit of fantasy on the side. Until next time, thank you very much for watching.